Amen. Please be seated. I will admit, first off, that it was only a few years ago that I really came to understand what Juneteenth celebrates. I had heard the word Juneteenth many times before, but I apparently hadn't had the curiosity to learn more about it, which surprises me in a way, but then again, it also doesn't. Because until quite recently, most white Americans likely presumed that Juneteenth was someone else's holiday, and that we weren't responsible for knowing much about it. Sort of in the way that I still only have a vague idea of what many Muslim and Jewish holidays actually celebrate. I'm aware of their existence and of their yearly repetition without knowing a whole lot about their meaning. Well, Juneteenth finally became a holiday that I knew about and cared about back in 2020 after Bethel AME and Bryn Mawr Prez hosted a Zoom event with the musician Kim Harris. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder in May 2020, Juneteenth had a particular poignancy that summer. It was powerful to sing together, even over Zoom, at a time when so many of us wanted to gather in protest, but were too afraid of getting COVID to be out on the streets. As I've been thinking and learning more about Juneteenth this year, new layers of the emancipation story have continued to unfold. In today's bulletin blurb, for instance, I have perpetuated the problematic idea that the news of emancipation didn't reach Africans in Texas until June 19, 1865. Now, after a week of learning, I know better. Surely the enslaved people in Texas knew about emancipation. For by June 1865, it had been 2 years since President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, 5 months since Congress passed the 13th Amendment, and 2 months since Robert E. Lee surrendered the Confederate Army. So when United States Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, with 1,800 soldiers on June 19, 1865, why did he need to make his own proclamation declaring that all slaves are free in Texas? I read an article this week entitled "The Hidden History of Juneteenth" and learned that white planters had forcibly moved tens of thousands of slaves to Texas during the Civil War, hoping to keep them in bondage for as long as possible. Even after Robert E. Lee surrendered, Confederate Texans still dreamed of sustaining slavery there. It was not until June 2nd, 1865, that Confederate leaders finally surrendered the state of Texas, just a few short weeks prior to Juneteenth. General Granger's arrival in Galveston, therefore, marked the first effective intervention of the United States to finally put an end to slavery in Texas. Ending slavery could never be achieved by proclamation alone, of course, but also required the enforcement of new emancipatory laws, in many cases with assistance from the United States Army. In the weeks following Juneteenth, 50,000 United States troops arrived in Texas and were stationed in 40 locations across the state. The Army worked to ensure that enslaved Africans would be protected as they left plantations and negotiated their emancipation. The Army also worked to actively dismantle slavery by arresting judges and sheriffs, taking control over court cases, running military commissions, and suspending habeas corpus. It took many months of hard work to bring an end to slavery in the state of Texas. But together, freed persons and the Army collaborated to exorcise the demonic practice of slavery in the state of Texas, which was surely something to celebrate, and which is how the annual celebration of emancipation on June 19th began. Someone had finally come to help make emancipation real. Let's turn then to our gospel reading from Luke. In today's gospel passage, Jesus meets a man afflicted by demons. This man's community had decided to chain and shackle him naked in a cemetery. The demons afflicting this man were so frightening that his community had decided that he had to be removed, imprisoned, exiled. And yet the demons afflicting this man were so strong that he continuously broke his chains and was driven by his demons into the wilderness. It's interesting, isn't it? His demons drove him not into town, where he would upset the townsfolk, but into the wild, where he would be alone. Was he really as dangerous then as people thought he was? Was he actually a real threat of any kind? After Jesus casts out the demons that had been afflicting this man, and we'll have to explore the whole issue of the pigs another time, the townsfolk weren't very happy. But surprisingly, they don't seem to be particularly upset about the loss of 2,000 pigs. Here's what the text says. The townsfolk found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. Were the townsfolk afraid of more pigs dying if Jesus stuck around? Or were they, as seems to be the case, afraid of something else? Why did the townsfolk want to send Jesus away? It seems to me that perhaps the root of their fear was a disruption of their way of life, and not so much their economic life, but rather the way that they managed difference. These townsfolk, it seems, were not interested in learning to see the man who had been possessed by demons as one of them. He was different and therefore fearsome. And then Jesus arrived and upended their arrangements. Now the man who had previously been afflicted by demons would have to live among them as one of them. But what if he became possessed again? What if he wasn't actually fully healed? What if reintegrating him into society meant putting the whole community in danger? These are perhaps the kinds of things that the townsfolk might have been afraid of. And so, in a way, the townsfolk were reacting to Jesus in a way similar to how the white plantation owners in Texas reacted to the arrival of 50,000 U.S. soldiers in 1865. Both Jesus and the U.S. Army, in this case, came to overturn injustice. Both came in a way to foment a healing process. But that healing would involve undoing social arrangements that kept some people subjugated and disenfranchised. In Texas, the heinous practice of enslaving other human beings, and in Gerasa, the heinous practice of imprisoning and isolating persons suffering from mental illness. Because that is how we now tend to understand what the ancient world called demon possession. Now we call it mental illness. And our ability to care for those who suffer from mental illness hasn't advanced as far from the practices of the ancient world as one might expect. Consider these statistics. People with mental illness are 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than hospitalized. People with mental illness stay 4 to 9 times longer in jail than someone without a mental illness, for the exact same charge. We also know, of course, that people of color are incarcerated at much higher rates than white people. Black people make up only 13% of the U.S. population, and yet 38% of inmates in American prisons are black. Some researchers have argued that racial disparities in the diagnosis and treatment of mental health issues exacerbate this problem of mass incarceration. For instance, in one case, research has consistently shown that African Americans are overdiagnosed or misdiagnosed with schizophrenia and underdiagnosed with mood disorders. Mental health providers seem to consistently underemphasize the relevance of mood symptoms among African Americans compared with other racial and ethnic groups, which of course has real-world implications of all kinds. because a misdiagnosis of schizophrenia can result in ineffective treatment, use of the wrong medication for the disorder, an inaccurate prognosis for the future, and lowered expectations for recovery. Which is relevant this Juneteenth weekend, because for there to be any truth in the final hymn that we will sing today, it is incumbent upon us as people of faith to care about the continuing race-based inequities in our society and to try to do something about them with God's help. I pray that we may not be among those who would send Jesus away when he comes to bring uncomfortable healing into our midst. I pray that we would not prefer our own comfort and safety over our neighbor's freedom and well-being. For as we hear in Isaiah, Jesus came to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke. May it be so.